Welcome everybody to St. John's Catholic Church in beautiful Beloit, Kansas. This structure was built in the early 1900s, and we're going to focus on the bells today. The bells were put in the 1950s with a mechanical system to drive. The problem that we have is that one of the clutches on the drive isn't working, and we're not sure what we're dealing with, and there is no one around anymore that even works on this system. So because of that, we're going to document this in hopes that we can help someone else out with these old systems and try to give you a basic idea of what you're working with. And to start with, we have to get clear up to the top of the bell tower. We're in the bell section here. Just to give you an idea, in the 1950s, this was all put in. What we're dealing with is about a 300-pound small bell, a 1,300-pound bell, an 1,800-pound bell, and then a 3,200-pound bell. So 3, 13, 18, and 3,200s. These were all put in at about the 1950s. It's all mechanical and cable lift system, and pretty impressive. Okay, doing video, undoing the bells. First thing we got to do is back off the turnbuckle to loosen up the cable. Cables are doing a single wrap down to where they go completely under and they connect to the other side of the bell. Both sides do that. We'll loosen up both cables and they're spooled up around there. We'll get it good and loose. I've backed off the jam nuts just enough to loosen the turnbuckle so we know about where we need to be when we tighten back up. Okay, motor assembly. We got two bad clutches here, one bad clutch, the north clutch. The machinery is from Verdin out of Cincinnati, Ohio. The motor is a master alternator motor. It appears to be a 3/4 horse motor, pretty heavy unit. What we need to do is we've got to get this lower shaft assembly out of here. First off, we're probably going to get the cable assembly off here first. Possibly take the motor assembly off, and then we got to evaluate how we're going to get this shaft assembly off. We may tear the whole thing, just peel parts off as much as we can. We may take the rest of the assembly down to a shop where we can work on it down below. More to come there. Okay, what we're going to try to do first is we're going to try to peel off the extremities of this assembly and just take the whole assembly down to the shop. That means we're going to remove the motor, we're going to remove the back gear assembly behind there, and we're going to attempt to try to remove this pulley so I can leave it coiled. The pulley is inset on the shaft about 3/4 of an inch, and each of the cables, get me good close up here, each cable that goes around 1, 2, 3, 4 times before it is mounted inside here. And this cable here is mounted 1, 2, 3 times before it gets mounted back into the cable back here on the same side. Take a look, get a good shot in here. Can you see it? So both cables, the outside cable and the inside cable, both come through and mount up here, okay? But it's the front, the cable set that goes out wraps around 4 times. The cable back behind wraps around 3 times. Okay, on the motor mount, we've just pulled the motor off, we disconnected, and we kind of taped the wires so they're color-coded, white to white, red to red, blue to blue. But there is gear lash between this main gear and the motor gear. To set that properly, they use just basically 4 3/8 washers. And that appears to be all that there is. The rest of that, the other bar is welded to the assembly so it won't come off. But for shimming purposes, they used 4 3/8 washers to shim the motor up to get the correct gear lash. Okay, we're going to remove the counter arm assembly here. That's what I'm going to call it anyway. We've got a series of 3 bolts here and 2 bolts on top, and this whole strap assembly should remove all this assembly completely away. Should just take 3 bolts there and the 2 bolts on top. Okay, now that we've got the turnbuckle piece off the back and the motor off that, we're ready to remove the whole assembly off from the wood. We could pull the 6 lag screws that go into the wood, but I'd rather not disturb those lag screws. We can get to these 3/8 bolts that are in the legs. We're able to access those. So we are going to go ahead and pull the 4 bolts, the 2 bolts off each corner, total of 8 bolts. There is 1 shaft that goes through that we're going to have to disconnect and get a good view down here. We will pull this pivot shaft far enough to get the clutch assembly, the arm, out of there, and then we'll probably shove the shaft back into place after we get it released. Because the pivot shaft is tied to the channel irons down there on the bottom, we pulled the key on this through shaft so we could release the arm assembly, and we'll just put it back in. 1 spacer goes on each side, and we just put the shaft back in so it's in place. Our rig is now free and ready to be pulled up. We may go ahead and remove these last 2 support bars just to reduce a little weight, but we'll see. It might help to carry the thing. We'll see when we get it pulled off. We've got the assembly pulled off there. These cross supports, we did go ahead and put bolts back in there just to give some rigidity and stability. Things were going to get a little floppy if we left them off. There does not appear to be any shims of any kind underneath this motor. It sits solid. Yes, it sits solid on the pad. So there are no shims dealing with that. We are free. Now we just got to get it down the hole. Okay, we're in the shop. This is about a 1950s unit, circa 1950s that this was installed. The motor was sitting up here. This was the main drive gear. It weighs, this unit now with the motor off and the tail off, weighs about 150 pounds. 2 people can handle it, but it's awful hard to get up in the choir loft. So, but we elected to bring the whole unit down because we're not sure of the disassembly. We do know that this back gear, I'm going to refer this to the rear, and this will be to the front because this is where the cable pulley goes on. This is going to be the rear here. The arm, the clutch arm itself, dog legs toward the rear. We will note that. Right now the clutches are free, but the clutch housing plates are solid on the shaft, so I'm unsure how we can get I don't think we can get the shaft to slide through. What we're going to start with is taking this rear gear dog off. We'll have to make sure of our spacing because there's going to be some lash there that we're going to have to be aware of and reset when we put it back on. We're going to undo these bolts, and then we're going to start pulling these plates off to see what all can slide off from the rear. Upon loosening this shaft, it was just a lock collar on there that kept it on the back, but it slid clear in all the way to the shaft. It was buried. So for future reference, we'll have it slid all the way in. There may be some lash adjustment that we can work with, but for the initial setting, it was all the way in. Okay, we've removed the top 2 bolts up here and removed the back bevel gear off the rear. We're going to see if we can take that off. We're going to let the counter gear just come with the big bar, and we're going to remove that whole housing as such. The counter gear is what provides for the opposite direction. You'll notice the front gear is a direct drive, where here we're dealing with a counter gear situation. This is on the rear. Okay, once we've got the main housing off, there is a spacer, a brass bushing between the gear and the outside housing. We're going to pull that housing off, and we will expose our clutch housing here. There are no spacers inside there. It's just the 1 spacer that goes on the back of the gear toward the back side. Okay, we're now exposing our clutch. You can see that there's our clutch jog. There's what actuates the clutch. Inside this clutch assembly are two bolts, Allen screw bolts that hold the clutch tight to the shaft. The face of the clutch to the shoulder of the back of the shaft is 8 3/4 inches. I'm not sure if that's a set location, but we're going to note that. It appears that I could slide this clutch back enough to get these bolts loosened up so I can get the set screws out, but I'm going to take this little pivot bearing off, so that'll allow this arm to come back a little bit further so I can get an Allen wrench in there. Okay, we're going to remove this little pivot bearing. We're going to try to remove this little pivot bearing. There we go. And we're going to slide this back. Now we can expose these two set screws here so we can try to slide this clutch assembly off. Okay, now that we've removed the clutch from the shaft, there's the keyway. I took special care to measure that distance from the end of the shoulder, but there are a couple of holes here that these set screws go into. So when we put this unit back on, well, it'll be important for us to find those holes and get that back, and that will locate where that clutch needs to be set. Okay, we found an initial problem. The arm for the clutch is broken, and now we're going to see about taking this clutch apart to see what we can do to try to affect that. This clutch assembly will now slide out of there. There's the key that goes into. Clutch assembly is as follows. This is your clutch, your brake that rides in the inside of the pulley. And what we have here is this mechanism. These two mechanisms right here match up like this. And as you tighten this tightening screw, it draws it up, which pushes out on this clutch assembly and gives you your preload. The thing that we have to be very careful about is when we put this mechanism down in there, that angle has to be turned in such a way that it sits on this unit like here, so that when we have this in here and we tighten this adjustment screw, it will pull them and separate that clutch. And then of course you have your set screw here that locks it in position. What we have here though is a problem that our shaft is broken. So we were turning and turning and turning all we could, but because this shaft was broken, it isn't actuating the clutch, and that's why this clutch was failing. So we will attempt to try to get this dressed back up again and see if we can get this working again. We've got the repair made to the shaft. Broken piece added on, everything's cut out so that this piece will fit in there and pivot off the corner of that bar. And so that we understand what's happening, this adjustment piece sits inside there with this piece up against it like there. When I tighten that adjustment, it pushes this rod up, which will take the free play out of my clutch. And then when it comes time to actuate, this bar being in this hole actuates on this pin. I can do it like this. It pushes on that pin and pushes the pin this way. So by pushing on it, it separates that clutch, and that's what does the grabbing. So I think we've got now with this welded, we are loose in here. Everything's got good free play. we can go ahead and get our adjustment piece back in there. We'll lubricate it up real good, and I think we can get this clutch put together. So we've got everything put in there. We've got our angle piece shoveled down in the hole. We've got the adjuster. It's put in there. So what happens now is when that bell tightens up, you can see the action on it. That's what spreads and grabs onto the clutch. This is a steel on steel. There is no packing on this thing. This is basically steel on steel. And so what we do when we want to take out the free play, we can tighten this nut, pull this mechanism further in. See, if I have it down like there, the arm's clear to there. As I pull this thing further in, my arm drops, and that's where my tension starts. So that's where your tensioning is coming from. So we've got that all lubricated up real good. When we get it into the disc, we'll kind of see where we're at, and we'll kind of set a pre-tension on it. But I think we're ready to get this one put back together. Once we got the back half off, then we were able to slide the clutch arm mechanism off, and from there we could just slide the entire shaft out of the front hub assembly. We don't necessarily have to take the clutch mounting bracket off of the shaft because we can pull the entire shaft out and get everything disassembled, cleaned up, and inspected. So we've reassembled. We had the shaft pulled out. We cleaned our parts out and our clutch. We inspected all the parts, and basically everything was good. So we cleaned everything up, lubricated it, get the clutch pack put together, made sure we had the shim washer in there, got our gear on, shoved everything on, then got our clutch arm in there. The one thing you do have to be careful of with that clutch arm is that you pulled it off and got it back on the same way. You're really gonna hate yourself if you put that back together and that arm's on the wrong side of the shaft. So from there, we're gonna go ahead and put the other shaft on. We will get the other clutch mount plate firmly in those guide holes there and tighten down securely, and then we'll bring it all together. Okay, one thing you have to remember when you're mounting this last clutch plate on, you get it slid on, you have to slide the clutch out enough that you can get access to your Allen screw that goes down in the hole. And you've got to make sure that you're lined up with that hole to get your proper positioning, which I can look down in the hole and I can see my pilot hole. We're in good shape, so we can tighten it down and secure it. Would suggest that you kind of work together on the two bolts to make sure that you've got it where you need it to be. We're ready to reassemble here, and in working on figuring out how things work here, we discovered that you really don't have to disassemble everything to get to one clutch. And simply put, well, I mean, we're doing the reassembly. I don't really want to take it all apart again, but you can get this clutch away from the backing plate, which is bolted solid to the shaft, by removing the locking screw and then removing the adjustment screw, because we demonstrated the adjustment screw is attached to that floating wedge that floats back and forth on here. By removing that screw, that floating wedge will come out this side and come completely out. That will let that floating wedge that's in this galley right through here drop completely down, and then we'll let this hinge come free, this control arm come free, and the arm will come out, and then this whole assembly will come away, because right now, you know, you can't because the control arm is right there. So it's a very simple assembly, but you know, you've got your mount bolts in there for your plate, which are kind of hard to get to with this on here. Well, you can get this apart, and you don't even have to get to that if you don't want to, if you don't want to remove the whole thing or get to the center bearing. So, and then reassembly, of course, is just the other way. You drop your floating wedge in there, take care that it's angled properly, drop your floating wedge in there and drop that floating wedge down. Then you can put this arm in, and you can reach in there and shove that floating wedge back up in there to engage that arm, and then start pushing your adjusting wedge back into this mechanism, screw your bolt tight, and bring it up there to where you need to, and find the adjustment that you want to get this completed where you want. Now, when we assembled this, we threw a good dose of lubriplate in that galley, in the floating wedge area, just a good dose of lubriplate in there to make sure that everything stayed slick for a long time. But be careful that you don't get a lot of oil, and even take some time to clean the oil out of these clutch faces so you don't have a lot of grease and oil here. It's just a basic metal on metal wedge, and we learned in our servicing process that you can over-oil these things and they get to be rather slippery, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's very easy then that if you wanted to just work on half of this unit, you could do it with the assembly mounted up in the church. You wouldn't necessarily have to bring the whole thing down. By removing your motor, removing your backing gear mechanism like we demonstrated very early, either one of these housings will come off. In fact, if you wanted to pull this entire shaft, once I've got this back one off, I can take this entire shaft, as long as everything was smoothed out on your main shaft, I could pull this entire assembly off of here and leave this front half mounted up in the bell tower. So just some things to consider. We weren't sure what we were getting into, so we decided to bring the whole thing down. But as simple as these units are, they can very easily be worked on and managed up inside if you had to. So, but now that, you know, we put our plate on, we dropped our floating wedge down in there, we shoved our gear and our arm in there and got it to where it made contact, reached in that hole, pushed that floating wedge up, and then inserted our adjusting wedge, screwed it in, and now everything, here's your action, there's your brake action right there, and we'll make final adjustments once we get it up in there. Then it's a simple matter, getting your gear back on. Don't forget your washer. And then putting this back on the assembly. Good dose of lubriplate with everything. Get the gears to line up a little bit. We are basically and of course the gears don't want to line up, but I think you get where I'm going here. Well, when I have two sets of hands, I'll get the gears lined up and we'll get it put together. But we'll get this all slid together again, just making contact down there. Then we'll get our bull gear put on and we'll have this thing, and then I'll show you how we service it up. We've got everything put together, the main shaft, we've got our thrust bearing in here, and then this back piece on, shoved all the way in. Now right now what I want to do is kind of preliminary adjust the clutches. What you want on those clutches is you want to tighten that screw to squeeze that clamp together, okay? So you've got just a little bit of play there because you want that shaft to turn freely. If I press down on that, that shaft is going to lock up. So you want just a little bit of free play there so that shaft will turn nice and free on both sides, and then you'll finish it up when you get attached. Sorry about that. Sometimes it takes a couple set of hands to get a lot of gears lined up. Now that we got the gears on and everything, got the washer on, got this plate in, got our bull gear put on here, and that pin that just goes clear up against the shaft, and that tightened up. The mechanism is ready to work now, okay? And because the clutch is free there, you know, the shaft will turn. You know, you put a little actuation on those clutches, and then everything turns. So I do want to talk a little bit while we've got some daylight here, the service issues that we work on this. It's very simple, and if you're in an indoor atmosphere where this thing is fairly protected, it doesn't take a lot. Basically, you're dropping just some good 30 weight oil. You have your oil ports on the top, and they run down your main galleys to lubricate your bushings there. Also down deep, you have those galleys, just shove some oil in those galleys, let it set. It'll run through and lubricate those shafts. On the back sides of these pulleys, there is, if you can get a oil hole, get a little light in there. You see a little bit of an oil there. You can shoot some oil down in that hole. That'll oil that bushing. You get the bushing oiled up around there and get that. You'll see another one on the back side of this pulley. You'll also see another one. Also within the center on this pilot bearing, it's good to get some oil down in there. You'll have an oil hole right there. It's good to get some oil in that pilot bearing to oil things up. Now, a couple of places I would caution you on oiling. One is, as you bring that shaft around, you've got a little oil plug here, galley, that goes in here and oils directly onto that brake face, okay? Also, this hole right here will also get you down there and oil directly on that brake face. Don't oil those. Really all that ends up doing is just making your brake mechanism slimier, and so when this tries to catch, it does a lot of slipping. We've actually used those ports when we found ourselves over oiling things, throwing a lot of brake clean down into those ports to try to dry those brakes out. So that, if you're in an outdoor atmosphere and you find that your brakes they're grabbing too much, you may want to drop a little oil in there to try to free things out or keep things from rusting, possibly a little silicone spray, something like that. But generally speaking, just leave those dry is what we've found is the best thing to do there. So your ports on top, just to get your bushings oiled there. The ports here, there's holes on the back side of your gears. Those are really your oil points, just a good 30 weight oil. We'll keep those lubricated. We do it where it's inside maybe 2 or 3 times a year. Remember, these bells aren't ringing constantly. They're just, you know, once or twice a day when they go on. And if it's in a covered atmosphere, they'll stay fairly lubricated. If you're out in the weather more, you feel like you need to give it a little more, give it a little more. But it's pretty basic. A little 30 weight oil in the ports, let her go. Okay, we got the assembly on, back off, we'll look at the whole thing. We got the motor mounted on. We got this pulley mounted on right here. We got our loops back where we needed to be, and the turnbuckles on the cables tight. They need to be snug. Don't have to go crazy, but they need to be snug. The important part, come around here, is when we put this back bull gear together, it's very important that your bell is hanging straight down and that this cam here is straight up. Back up a little bit there, please. This cam needs to be straightened up to be properly timed. If you had that halfway around, things would not work so correctly. You would not like how it would react. So make sure that your cam is about straight up when you time into this bull gear here with your bell hanging straight down. We've got the major block put back on with this cam timed. Go around the other side to see the cam. Like I say, we've got this cam timed pretty much straight up and down with the bell hanging down. That's what you're shooting off for. Got the arm hooked up here. We also, when we first assembled, we got our pivot point down at the bottom. We've got it hooked up there. We've got a little bit of tension on one of the brakes right now. That's what you should have to start the process. And there is a little bit of grab there, which is what we want. So we will do some trying here and we'll see what we got. Adjust the clutches. We've got a little bit of free play here. Okay, we break this nut loose. Okay, then this is our adjusting nut right here. This is what pulls that adjusting cam in and pushes up on the floating cam. Okay, the trick is you want to be able to free turn that thing. You don't want to be turning the bells or you're too tight. So we're just going to give that a few turns to make sure we're up there. We're getting awful close. See, I've grabbed a hold there. That's too tight. So we're going to back that off about a half a turn or so just because everybody backs things off a half a turn. And we'll tighten that up. Did you free up on me? Yes. And we'll tighten that lock nut back up. And she should be free to work. See, the bells are swinging, but the gear's not turning. Come back here, put tension back on the system. Gonna have to pull hard there. There we go. We now have tension on the brake. Let's play it, Mr. Gingler. Let's see what we got. You have bells. Well, folks, that's it. We've got the bell systems in. They've been ringing wonderfully. I hope that we've given you some basic ideas of how the mechanics work on these old IT Verdin systems. As you can see, they're very simple systems, and they're things that could be managed. We were proposed that we were supposed to spend $30,000, $40,000 to rework this whole bell system, and we were a little afraid of what was up there. But after getting into it, it's a very simple, economical, and a very easy to work on system with someone that just has a little bit of technological, or just a little bit of mechanical skills. It's fairly easy to work with. Don't be afraid of it. I hope that this video helps you out. I apologize, it's a little crude and rudimentary, but hopefully we've given you some basic ideas of what we're working with. Thank you very much.